Hi, my name is Stacy Cacciatore, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about ethnography. This is part of the Clemson University RCID program submitted to Dr. Victor Vitanza. So to kick off our discussion on ethnography, I want to talk with you guys about Claude Levi-Strauss. He was French, and he was born in 1908 in Brussels and died in October 2009 in Paris. He was a French anthropologist and ethnologist whose work was key in the development of theory of structuralism and structural anthropology. He argued that the savage mind had the same structures as the civilized mind, and that human characteristics are the same everywhere. Let's define structuralism. It's the search for the underlying patterns of thought in all forms of human activity. So, to kick off our discussion about him, he wrote an article, and it's extremely interesting because in 1938, him and his wife spent a half-long-year expedition to study the Nambikwara tribe. What he did is he actually wrote a little bit about his time with the Nambikwara tribe, and I want to point out a few things that I think are really fascinating about this particular story. So, first of all, the Nambikwara tribe was actually 75 people among 17 families, and he lived with them for half a year to understand more about their customs and their daily life and that type of thing. But what I find particularly fascinating is his description of their writing and reading ability. So he talked a little bit about the fact that when he spent time with them, he said that what's not extraordinary is that they have no written language, but what is interesting is the fact that they actually don't even know how to draw. He said that he handed out sheets of paper and pencils, and they started imitating how he wrote. And he had not yet amused them with his drawing. So what they were doing, it turns out, was that they were actually imitating him and trying to write as if he was writing, mimicking his same type of movements. But the funniest story that I found was that the story of the chief. So the chief asked him for a writing pad. And when he was speaking, he would draw wavy lines on the paper, and he showed it to Levi. And he wanted Levi to respond. He was half taken in by his own make-believe. Each time he completed a line, he showed it to Levi and examined it anxiously as if he expected the meaning to leap off the page. He would have a look of disappointment on his face when he realized that what he was scribbling on the paper maybe didn't necessarily what he was trying to communicate. But then after every time he wrote something down, he would go on to describe what he was trying to say, and it relieved Levi from having to actually read it. Now, he said this went on for hours, and he questioned, was he deluding himself? Was he trying to articulate to his tribe that he could write, that he could read? Was he trying to establish power? It's interesting because what Levi said is that he wanted to astonish his companions to convince them that he was acting as an intermediary agent for the exchange of goods. He was in allegiance with a white man and shared his secret. So he was trying to exert this level of power over his tribe by showing that he was able to read and write. Now, what I also find extremely interesting about this story that Levi shares is he goes into an elaborate story right after that about his mule. Okay, so what we hear about his mule is that he was riding and his mule bucked him and he was lying there and he thought he was going to die and he was going to be stranded. And then the natives finally got him and got him from the brush, and then he had lost all of his equipment. But here's what I find interesting. So he tells us the story of the mule. What does that mean? Why does he insert that in the middle of talking to us about reading and writing and power? I'll tell you what. So he calls he says when the tribe goes to retrieve his equipment, it's mere child's play for them. Okay, let's make a correlation here. So child's play. Child's play here in America is drawing and coloring. That's what our children learn how to do in preschool, right? We consider that child's play. But yet this tribe did not have that basic learning to be able to draw, to color, to write, to read. They didn't have any of that, whereas here in America we view that as child's play. But he's making a subtle correlation here because the children in the Nambikwara tribe they are able to retrieve his belongings, all of his equipment that he lost in the brush that we as Americans couldn't find. He said, he would have had no idea how to recover that information or all that equipment, but yet for them it was mere child's play. So what he's doing is he's drawing parallels to help us understand that while Americans may view themselves as more sophisticated because they can read and write and draw, there are things that we can't do that the tribe can do, and it's essential for their survival. Writing and drawing to them isn't essential. We tend to have a tendency to have an ethnocentric point of view and believe that if we do something or have a certain view, that everyone should. We look down upon and scoff on cultures who aren't educated or value the same things of us. But Levi shows us, by literally placing himself in an embarrassing and dangerous situation, that our skills are equally as unsophisticated and elementary, but in different ways. So I find that really fascinating. He goes on to say, if it had not been a question of acquiring knowledge, of remembering or understanding, but rather of increasing the authority and prestige of one individual or function at the expense of others. So he talks to us a little bit about writing as an institution. And he goes on to talk a little bit about that. He also explains the life that he had with the villagers, right? So he talks about how they go through this kind of elaborate gift exchange, how they wanted him to poison one of his mates in his, that came over to his particular camping area and was eating his food. They didn't get along with him. They had to fight over a woman, and they wanted him to poison him. So he goes on and talks about the life and culture and customs and what they do and some of the rituals that they go through and how they exert power over each other. And he actually has a really excellent photographic essay, which you'll see here the pictures on the screen. I was able to find this in another journal article where he actually doesn't talk too much about his photography when he was over there, but there's some extraordinary pictures that go along with some of his descriptions of his experience with the tribe. And again, the fact that part of their elaborate rituals are the exchanging of thread and cotton. Now, what this has to do with writing, again, he kind of tells this story, and it seems a little unrelated. But what I think how he's correlating these two things is that the fact that he mentioned something about the fact that they demand these presents of each other, but they rely upon the generosity of the other. It doesn't occur to them to evaluate, to argue, bargain, demand, negotiate. If they end up dissatisfied with what they don't like, they have feelings of resentment and aggression, and they end up taking it out in different ways at different times, but they don't articulate in that moment, hey, I didn't want that particular exchange, or I don't feel as if that's, that particular item is equivalent to what I have exchanged with you. So I think he's correlating that to the fact that if they had, written language, if they had a different level of communication, that they might be able to hold their exchanges a little bit differently. And the bottom line of this entire essay is that knowledge is power. So having this, people who can write can learn from the past. Is one thing that he says. You can learn from the past. The fight against illiteracy goes hand in hand with the extension of military service and proliferation. The fight against illiteracy is also connected with the increase of government authority over citizens. And that's so people can say, that ignorance of law is no excuse. After he left the Nambikwara tribe, he mentioned the fact that the fellow people actually abandoned the chief. And because of what he did, if you remember what I was saying about him pretending as if he could read and write and kind of holding, even though he couldn't, but he was kind of exerting that power over others, that once Levi left, they actually abandoned the chief and no longer had allegiance to him. And because of his betrayal of trying to align to Levi and some of the values that he possessed rather than the tribe. So I found that very interesting. The second article I want to talk about that's related to this ethnography type of subject is Anthropology's Native Problems, Revisionism in the Field by Louis Sass. So he talks a little bit about Renato and Rosaldo, and he goes into the fact that those are students in anthropology at Harvard, and they went to the Philippines to live among the Ilongot, a small tribe in the jungles of the island Luzon. They wanted to study ritual. So the Ilongot tribe, this is what's really interesting about this story. And here's a great picture of that particular tribe. When they got there, they didn't find any of the things that they had been taught to look for. It said that the Ilongot had not developed elaborate rituals and myths, the stuff of standard ethnographies. What they did have were stories, seemingly endless tales of hunting expeditions, migrations to new parts of the forest, and headhunting raids. What I found really interesting about this part was actually, I thought as they were talking about kind of listening to the natives kind of drone on and on about these stories with no plot, and kind of just talked about actual places and things versus having the standard American version of a plot with, a climax and that type of thing. I thought about how conversations typically go with children, right? Sometimes they'll tell you about the day, their day, and go on to say, someone went to the playground, they brought a ball and they threw the ball and I caught the ball and then we ran, and it's kind of they can go on for hours about what they did, or a particular incident or a child, or a situation without kind of any point in the story, or anything to kind of hook the listener. So I felt like that was kind of the same, right, as what you're hearing when you were talking with a child about their day. It's kind of the same thing where it just kind of goes on, and you're wondering, okay, what's the point of this story? But here's what's really interesting about this. So from a storytelling perspective, their stories don't revolve around plot, but once they stopped to listen and started to instead of viewing, again, listening to the story from an ethnocentric point of view on the typical American layout of plot, they began to listen to them and actually discover that they had a lot of information and a lot of tales of overcoming obstacles, encountering unexpected items of importance. And they had dismissed it because of their assumption of primitive societies. So this is the crux of the issue here in the article. They mention, that studying ethnography is akin to studying the rules of baseball. It doesn't tell you everything. So they use a particular sports metaphor, but I think about this in a lot of respects on how basically textbook learning cannot replace learning by doing. I think about that in my own workplace where, we try, we give people policies and procedures and handbooks and guidelines on how to do things and how the company runs and how they're supposed to respond to situations. But until you're actually in the situation, you're doing it, you're observing it, you're not just looking at it from an academic or textbook point of view, but you're in it and learning about it in the situation, it brings you so much more. And I think that's what really is important when we look at the study of ethnography, is having folks who are in the field actually learning about cultures firsthand, not putting their own culture's point of view ahead of it and viewing it through that lens, but appreciating it for what it is. I think that's really the bottom line there. The third item I want to talk about to kind of tie all this together is ethnographic surrealism, the predicament of culture in 20th century ethnography, literature, and art by James Clifford. So he defines surrealism as a circumscribed and aesthetic that values fragments, curious collections, and unexpected juxtapositions, that works to provoke the manifestation of extraordinary realities drawn from the domains of the erotic, the exotic, and the unconscious. Extremely interesting. What I'm focused on is fragments. It brings me back to kind of our beginning studies around the fragments of our pre-Socratic philosophers. It's the same type of thing where we're looking at culture from a series of fragments and trying to piece it all together. Ethnography, the general cultural predisposition that cuts through modern anthropology and the science that share with 20th century art and writing. The other is a crucial object of study. This one sentence is so important because really all of these things that we're thinking about and talking about from ethnography, we're talking about the other and ensuring that we are providing that full picture. That's what we've been talking about with the different tribes I had mentioned earlier. So there are three ethnographers that I want to talk about here. And the interesting thing is that all three of these, Mauss, Batille, and Metraux, all of them really are very similar in their background and their what they studied. And nearly every French ethnographer before the mid-50s, with the exception of Levi-Strauss, who I spoke about earlier, was the beneficiary of Mauss's direct stimulation. Mauss was a research scholar. His style, he liked to look at a long list of things or people in different parts of the world, what they do with their bodies. So, for example, it's normal for children to squat. He says we no longer know how to squat. So think about all the things that have typically been natural for us to do with our bodies, and we no longer do these things or have a need for them. Batille, his most influential book was Le System in 1957, and his beliefs are that transgression doesn't negate an interdiction, it transcends and completes it. Batille's lifelong project was to demystify and valorize this positive emotion of transgression in all its various forms. Batille is influenced by Mauss, but Batille himself has a tremendous influence on many, many people. Batille was a surrealist in the group. And then we have Metraux. Metraux participated in establishing ethnographic methods for codifying social life, material culture, and artistic forms. Metraux left personal documents in different parts of the world. He meticulously collected artifacts and documents from different cultures, and these are now part of collections in museums in Argentina, France, and the United States. So what I wanted to mention with these three philosophers and kind of what we're looking at next here is culture. Culture is something to be collected. It's, documents was an ethnographic display of images, text, objects, labels, a playful museum that simultaneously collects and reclassifies its specimen. So when we think about culture and ethnography is interested in both the beautiful and the ugly. And that means that you're going to have high art combined with enlarged photographs of big toes, folk crafts, African art, pre-Columbian, French carnival masks, cooking pots next to axe blades. I mean, what we see is all of these different things put in together. We don't want to kind of put that one lens of what we think of as art. But it's a combination, it's a collection of all these different things together. The other really interesting thing about this article is a discussion on Picasso. So what we see here, now we've been talking about ethnography, we've been talking about other cultures, talking about how there's a combination of art and how we put them all together. What we also should talk about is how art influences each other, how it builds off of each other and builds the collection. So Picasso actually, in 1905, he acquired a West African mask. From there, he discovered Cubism. You see that these on the screen right now, these are a combination, a collection of artworks from Picasso that kind of show his progression from the beginnings of his Cubism work and some of the other art that he created. And this was influenced by the African mask. But would he admit that? He's known for saying, "L'art nègre connaît pas," which means African art, never heard of it. So what he does claim that he was not influenced by the African art, that he kind of came up with this on his own. But it's very interesting because, clearly he was influenced by that. It's a known fact that the African art influenced his future works. And isn't that something we should all aspire to? I don't see that being a negative component at all, but I think that, think about Austin Kleon. His whole thing, show your work, and all of his books, they really focus on the fact that creativity is learning from other components before you. Nothing is original. Nothing's come up completely on your own. You're always learning from others. So I found that very interesting around Picasso as well. And the fact that in culture and collections and art, you're kind of combining all these things together. The cooking pots, the baskets, the famous paintings. And when I go to a museum, I often see that, and it helps me appreciate all the different forms of art. The last thing I want to mention that was in this article, and the reason why I want to conclude with this, is I do think, again, this is kind of the crux of what we're thinking about. So in this study, they made some notes on the human body in this other culture, as they were looking at what that culture valued, and they took some notes on this. But I found it very interesting because there was not a tone in the documentation of what they do with their body as being any kind of negative connotation, but I did take it as kind of an outsider's view in on saying, the mouth represented eating and gluttony. Men are obsessed with women's breasts and genitals. They call it Joe. Women seem to be obsessed with bellies and the anuses of men. Children are not allowed to touch the inside of their mother's thighs. All these kind of different customs and beliefs that they had. Body odor was a special defensive against power spirits. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but there were a lot of observations they made on the human body and how this other culture perceived it and acted and had customs around it. But what I found interesting is, what would someone say about our culture if they were observing it from afar? They would say things like, breaking wind is rude. For some reason, women shave hair from their legs and their armpits, but not men. I thought about some other customs that may be odd, that if for someone, again, from the outside looking in October, children go door to door and they say trick or treat, and they disguise themselves and ask for candy. We ask a groundhog to tell us if there's going to be 6 more weeks of winter or an early spring. Those are just some of the things I thought, walking under a ladder is bad luck, that I thought if someone was to look at our culture and observe it from the outside, there might be some things that they observe and think, are very strange indeed. And there are. I actually looked up some of this information online around, perceptions of Americans, and they have there's a lot of interesting things around perceptions of American culture, on what we like and what we do. And so I think what the important lesson in all of this is I'm going to go back to something in the very beginning that Claude Levi-Strauss said, which is that when we're looking at folks, that Levi-Strauss argued that the savage mind has the same structures as the civilized mind, and that human characteristics are the same everywhere. I want to hark back to that and kind of come full circle to what I mentioned in the beginning, because I think that's the central lesson here in all of these, is that there are so many characteristics that are the same. We may view other cultures as different. We may feel like different cultures have different priorities, or that they value different things. But in the end, we really are more alike than we are different. And we should make sure that we're studying other cultures with a view of not an ethnocentric point of view, but truly embracing what every culture has to bring. I'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave your comments on this particular presentation, and I would love to hear what you think and hear how you continue the conversation.